Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 682 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I'm joined by Dr. Rosie Alegado to talk about life and science. Listeners, I hope you enjoy getting a behind-the-scenes look into the life and experiences of another researcher in today's episode. And if you want to get to meet even more of today's scientists, you can check out our website at peoplebehindthescience.com or subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform. And today, Rosie is going to share some of her insights and stories. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our outstanding people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Rosie Alegado. So, Rosie, welcome to our show today. How are you?
Aloha mai kako. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thank you so much for joining us to share more about your life and your science. So we'd like to start, if we can, just by getting to know you a little bit as a scientist. Let me take a moment to tell our listeners a little bit more about your current position and how you got there. So listeners, Rosie is an associate professor of oceanography and sea grant at the University of Hawai'i Mānoa, where she is director for the Center of Ulana ʻIke and a member of the Center for Microbial Oceanography Research and Education. She is also director of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology Maile Mentoring Bridge Program, chair of the City and County of Honolulu Climate Change Commission, and a member of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Ocean Studies Board. This board serves as the U.S. National Committee for the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development 2020 to 2030 initiative. Now, Rosie received her bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in environmental health and toxicology from MIT. She was awarded her Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology from Stanford, and afterwards she conducted postdoctoral research in evolutionary biology at the University of California, Berkeley, before joining the team there at the University of Hawai'i Mānoa. And today, Rosie, we're excited to get to know you both as a scientist, of course, but also as a person. So can you first tell us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Well, I'm always thinking about science because to me, science is just an approach of understanding our natural world. And I'm just naturally curious about our natural world and all things. I guess I'll answer it by way of saying, what do I like to do outside of work when I'm outside of work? And I am a person who is really reconnecting right now with my cultural heritage as a native Hawaiian and engaging in a lot of practices which are scientific, I think. So it might not sound that way, but I'll try and describe it in a way that is. So my daughter and I, we dance hula, and I also engage in formalized chant training. And the reason why I say those are connected to science is because the practice of hula is actually a very holistic, many-faceted practice. It's not just dancing. It's not just showing up at a studio. In fact, it's really nothing like that. In order to dance hula, you have to understand the Maile, which are the songs that you are performing. You need to understand what are the correct regalia, or it's just much more than the word costume, what you put on your body. Those things are natural products which you harvest from the environment. In order to get those materials, in order to make your regalia, you have to have an understanding of what are the important species of that area, what is sustainable to harvest. And so pretty much in everything you practice in hula, it requires an understanding of the environment, which to me requires us to utilize our scientific mind. I mean, it's not always super intense like that. I will give you a guilty pleasure also. Mm-hmm. The other thing I like to do outside of work, when I'm really stressed, I would say my guilty pleasure is I also like to read trashy romance novels. So that's what I call my brain candy. When my brain is just overloaded and I just need a break, that's what I'll do. I'll just sit down and read a good book. or a trashy book or a funny book, whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Pick up a good book, something that you know you'll enjoy. And I think that is wonderful to hear that you're spending this time connecting with and really celebrating your cultural roots. I think that's so important. And it really brings you and the community together, I think, in a lot of ways. So that is wonderful. And I'd love to get to know your scientific side a little bit more as well. You hinted that this cultural side of your life is really interconnected with the science and the work that you do studying the environment and studying these wonderful microbes within it. So can you tell us more about your science and how you describe it to someone who might not be familiar with your work?
I study microbes, which are the smallest living organisms. And so for someone who's not in science, the way that I like to think about it is that microbes do a lot of the unseen work in our world. So do you like eating kimchi or do you like eating cheese? Microbes are the organisms that are creating these environments, these fermentative environments that allow us to enjoy these wonderful foods. Microbes are also the things that allow us to eat vegetables. If we didn't have microbes in our bellies, we wouldn't be able to process fiber the way that we can. And yes, microbes can also be scary and they can also cause disease. They can be pathogens, but basically microbes are driving a lot of the natural cycles on this earth. For example, every other breath, if we take a breath in and take a breath out, do it one more time and let it out, microbes give us the oxygen for every other breath we take on this planet. So that's what I explain, is that I'm really interested in understanding how microbes have shaped this place that we're living in right now.
That is phenomenal. And you can tell you are passionate about the work that you do. So I love getting to know a little bit more about what motivates scientists and what inspires them to do the work they do. So Rosie, do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something that really just motivates and inspires you?
I definitely do. And it's a quote by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I'm not a huge expert. I don't know his work super well, but this is actually a quote that my mom has adopted. And my mom was my first teacher. She's also a professor here at the University of Hawai'i. And the quote that she has always taken as her life motto, and I have also adopted, is his quote that says, "To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." So that's kind of my thinking of the world, is very much like, just keep going and really see how it's possible to integrate that into what we know about the world today.
Oh, absolutely. I think it sort of speaks to this struggle of science and how you just have to keep going. There's going to be barriers. You're going to be striving and struggling along the way. And I think it helps to have someone who is there motivating you, inspiring you along the way. You mentioned the role of your mother. I'd love to talk a little bit more about her, perhaps other role models or people who had a big impact on you.
My parents are definitely my biggest role model. Both of them are professors, my father passed away in 2020. My dad was a professor in the same department as my mother, which is the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Hawai'i at Mānoa. And so just having them as models in my life was so valuable because, I think it's also important to kind of think about the context of they weren't professors in sciences, they were professors in the social sciences. And in ethnic studies, the department was incredibly diverse. So it was actually a department full of historically underrepresented, minoritized scholars. So having grown up in an environment where everybody around me was brown, I am a brown person, it was incredibly inspirational. And what it taught me was that the university and the academic system, while there are a lot of really major inherent systemic problems, that it was a place that I could still thrive in, that I could exist in. So my parents definitely were incredibly vital to me seeing myself as just being a scholar. So I would say they're like my major role models. And then to me, a role model is someone who isn't just someone you model yourself after. Well, I think of my role models as also people who have been mentors to me. And so in high school, I had two amazing teachers. I went to a high school that was for Native Hawaiians, Kamehameha schools. And my first role model that I met was my honors biology teacher, Miss Gail Ishimoto. And she really taught me how to think like a scientist. And the other reason why she was a huge role model to me and why I role model the way that I mentor my students is because she was a really huge believer in the fact that the best way to learn to do science and to learn to do science well is to look around your environment and see what problems and questions there are that need answering, And to use that lens is to try and figure out what's going on in your own community. And so she's always been a big proponent of independent thinking. And just to come full circle, my daughter is now at that same school, and my high school teacher is her honor science research teacher right now. So I just love that so much. My second huge role model teacher in high school who absolutely changed my life was Dr. Charles Burrows. And he was the advisor to a high school hiking club, which was also an environmental science and stewardship club. And what he taught me was very much, first of all, he was a Native Hawaiian scientist who had a Ph.D. And he was probably the first or second Native Hawaiian scientist I had ever met in my entire life. And just to know that as an Indigenous person, people do this. Yes, he was a high school teacher, but beyond that, he just basically showed me that you can hold multiple knowledge systems and multiple worlds and be fluent in multiple ways of thinking and knowing. And so he was an absolutely huge influence on my life. And I know they're not like scientists as you think of scientists, but they taught science and they imbued in me how to think as a scientist. And then I think as far as when I was in graduate school, my major influences were definitely, I was co-advised by Manoa Tan and Stan Falco at Stanford. And then I also had a really huge friend and role model in Denise Monak, who's also at Stanford. And from Denise, I learned how to function as a super efficient person in science while being a mother. And in fact, how motherhood really was the driver for her efficiency and just everything she did. She is an amazing, amazing mentor. And then Stan, he was a great mentor to me because one of the things that I always carry with me and I pass on to my students is I walked into his office and he was like, what do you really want to do? I would go in every week and I would have all my notebooks because back then it wasn't digital. And I would be like ready to talk to him about all these experiments. And he'd be like, I'm not interested in any of that. How are you doing? And just him really wanting to know how I was doing as a person and bringing my whole self into the science and what I wanted to do for my life really gave me permission to think in that direction. And with Stan's really the person who I strategized my whole career as far as mapping out how to come back home to Hawaii as a scientist. And Stan recommended to me who I should consider doing my postdoc with. And he was very clear to the point he literally actually said, I'm already famous. I don't need your papers or whatever to make me famous. So this can just be all about you. And that was such a gift to find a scientist who really just cared about my success. So, and then of course, I would say that my final role model, I really consider my role model is Nicole King, who was my postdoctoral advisor. And again, she was somebody else who taught me how to be a mother in science, but also how to write. She is an amazing writer. And if I have time to give you one more role model, I would say that I do feel like the director of the Center for Microbial Oceanography Research and Education here, who is Dave Carl, has really been a very gentle faculty mentor to me and role model. And he just inspired me to just go and push forward. And to me, I think the pearl of wisdom that I take from Dave Carl is if you don't try, you don't get. So just be fearless and go for it. And the worst that you're going to get is a no. You know, the worst you're going to get is that you're not funded. But that work that you put in isn't for naught. You can always reutilize that grant application in another way. So I do feel like I've been very blessed to have supportive people in my life.
Definitely. Well, Rosie, it sounds like you've had some outstanding mentors sort of at every important step along the way. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how your journey began, though. You mentioned that your parents were both professors there at a local university. How did you maybe start getting interested in science, or what turned your eye towards this career path?
It's really interesting because I think my personality, I'm pretty stubborn. I think that is a good quality for a scientist to have, only because there's so much failure in science that you kind of have to be stubborn. But I think that the quality of my stubbornness also has allowed me to see past a lot of things that maybe other minoritized scholars who are in the system might get turned off by. So, and what I mean by that is people saying, oh, you gotta be like objective, or you have to like put away all your feelings. I don't know. I think my stubbornness, I'm just like, no, I refuse to listen to any of that. You know, people are always like, you have to be so objective. And I think my journey really just started by loving the natural world. And I never lost that. And I really take Robin Wall Kimmerer in her book, Braiding Grass, articulates the idea of experiments instead of being like this whole idea of like, what's the control? What's the experiment? She really and we're going for discovery she really articulates it as experiments are the way that we ask questions of the natural world, and then we interpret what that is to us. And I really think that that really articulates for me very well how I have gone through life asking questions. So it started really, like I said, in 9th grade biology with Miss Ishimoto and working with mealworms and trying to figure out like what is the best diet for them. We had to bring in working in teams, just really being curious and wanting to do things myself, wanting to be the one who is asking those questions and listening to the answers that nature is giving me. And sometimes nature's a piece of DNA, and sometimes it's a protein and it's being expressed, or sometimes it's something under a microscope. So as far as my actual scientific work, I had this question, and I don't know if it was scientific, but Native Hawaiian women way back in the day, ali'i, chief lineage women, they would dye their hair or they would bleach their hair. And I had this question about like, what kind of natural bleaches are there in Hawaii? Because we don't have Clorox or anything kind of bleach. So I had to do research to figure it out and do reading. And my mom introduced me to the very first Native Hawaiian person who ever got a Ph.D., whose name was Isabella Abbott. And she was an ethnobotanist. And my mom set up, and this is talking about privilege, because she was a professor, she knew Dr. Abbott. She was like, why don't you go and talk to her? Because she might know. And was like, yeah, this is potentially what they used. You need to go and find those plants, do some extracts, make some potions. I cut my own hair in order to test these different chemical compounds. And yeah, that was my first science fair project. My second science fair project, also Hawaii related, was to understand the evolutionary history of a flightless bird called the moa, which is the thembetachin. If you look at its bone structure, it looks like it could be a duck, but then other genetic evidence suggested that it might be a goose. So my goal was overly ridiculously ambitious. I decided I'm going to isolate mitochondrial DNA from these fossils and try and sequence them and determine the evolutionary background of this organism. And so, first of all, I was not successful at doing that because ancient DNA is really hard to work with. But in the process, my pre-project was I basically just took a lot of birds because I needed to have closely related species. I took local ducks, local geese, local chickens, and I actually ended up doing an evolutionary project using extant or living species. And that was pretty fun too. And I actually ended up getting stuff from the local butcher, abusing it because I had to replicate ancient DNA conditions. So I did all kinds of crazy stuff like throw it on the roof, bury it, and then dig them up again and then try and isolate DNA.
Oh,
anyway,
wow.
It was like a whole crazy thing. But I think what I showed myself was that I'm willing to go pretty far and get pretty gross to do my science. And then when I went to MIT, I just really fell in love with microbes, and it was over for me then. And I just thought microbes are amazing. They're the oldest organisms on this planet. They are capable of such amazing and dramatic diversity in terms of their metabolism, in terms of the environments that they inhabit. And I just knew that I needed to make my life work studying microbes.
Well, Rosie, that is an amazing story. And I know you are working on so many cool microbe-related projects at the moment. So is there one maybe that's a little bit there at the top of the list, just your absolute favorite that you were the most excited about that you want to share with us?
Sure. I am very excited right now about a project that I am working on that has been created and developed in partnership and co-developed with a Native Hawaiian community organization. Their name is Paipai Ohe'eia, and they're fish pond stewards. So they are trying to restore an 800-year-old fish pond on the island of Oahu. And our work together has been for us to understand what is the role of microbes moving around nutrients and how those communities of who are there are changing as the fish pond is being restored by these Native Hawaiian practitioners. So in a way, how is this restoration changing the community? It's kind of a, if we build it, will they come kind of question. And then who is changing in terms of that community and how are the functions of those microbes changing? Like, are we having a community that's going to be better at producing oxygen? Are they going to be better at producing a different kind of chemical compound? And is that going to help grow more fish? But I'm really, really excited about that. It's a really dynamic system because if you're changing the baseline conditions, you kind of have to go back and you have to keep really good track of everything that's going on. And this is a system that's not in a lab. It's outside. So that means that it's also vulnerable to things like hurricanes or floods or climate change. And so I didn't start off trying to study any of those things, but that is also like wrapped up in this, is trying to figure out some of those disturbances and what the impact is.
Absolutely. And I know doing research in the real world comes with, as you alluded to, a lot of challenges, a lot of frustration in many cases. And I know talking about this is so important in science because I think so many people have this idea that everything in science, you have this process, everything kind of follows A, B, C, D, and then that's the end. But that is not the case. Oftentimes things go wrong, people fail, projects don't work. So do you have a story, Rosie, of one of your own struggles or challenges or failures that you can share with us?
I mean, it kind of happens every day. Like when you are doing things not in a laboratory, you just don't have as much control over everything. And so it's always the weather. I mean, every single story I have that talks about things going off track has to do with weather happening. I wouldn't consider a failure. It was actually quite serendipitous, but we were working at the fish pond and we were trying to figure out, okay, how are the tides working? Where's it going? And so we deployed this instrument. And then alongside that, we were taking weekly samples. And then what happened is that my students were out there working and we got a hurricane warning and they were out there and we knew it was coming. We knew a big storm was coming. Then the storm started dissipating, but it didn't change track. And we were still out there. It was getting kind of windy. And I was like, you guys got to come in. And it turned out that the site that we were working at, well, the whole island actually was hit for the first time in 20 years by this tropical storm.
Oh, no.
And dumped a ton of water. And it was a bit scary, but I'm one who is like very adamant about working in safe conditions. And so we pulled the students out and I said, you know what? Don't even worry about the equipment. Just leave it. And I was really scared that all of our equipment was going to be destroyed. But it turns out that the equipment continued to take data. And it turned out to be very serendipitous in that we were able to now, instead of maybe pulling it out, we were able to capture all of that signal and all of that really important observations about the storm. And honestly, weather has done that every single time. I've been on another field project on the island of Molokai where the biggest storm in 5 years came in. I always feel like my lab sets out to just capture the baseline conditions and inevitably some large scale storm event comes in and we're like, okay, we're also capturing this as well. And I think our mindset has to be very much be prepared and be ready for anything. So I guess a little bit opportunistic, and not opportunistic in like a bad way, but just like always be prepared, have extra everything on hand because you may be able to capture more than what you expect out of these sampling ventures. So at the time, we were really, really struggling. I was really, really nervous. I was very concerned about student safety. I was concerned about equipment. Thought I was going to lose like a $15,000 instrument, but I had to think of my student safety first, and we just had to get out of there. Came back a week later, and it was still going. So that was really good. And so I think the bottom line is I always put my people first. And I think have that in mind. And then second of all, have that prepared mind and have extra of everything when you go out there.
I love it. And I love this mindset that you put out there of putting the people first. I think that's so important in science, kind of even beyond the fieldwork scenarios we can think of. And just this, I think, really perfectly illustrated your ability to be flexible and adaptable in these changing situations, sort of adapting the scientific questions you might be able to answer with the data that you're getting there. And I think that can lead to some really exciting scientific successes. And you've had many successes to celebrate. So, Rosie, do you have a favorite success story you'd like to share with me and our listeners?
It's hard because I think in science, I don't know what a success is. I feel really good every time a PCR works. I don't take any of that for granted. PCR is one of those things where the technology was developed, I want to say 35 years ago, maybe 30 years ago. It seems very rote. It's one of those things that has so many parameters that can go wrong. I don't take it for granted. So it really derived my success from my students. When we are able to, after a really long time, troubleshoot a problem and have it work through, that feels like success. So I guess what I'm saying is I celebrate success a lot of times in the little things. Obviously, if I get a big grant, if a paper gets submitted, yes, I'm extraordinarily happy. That's a huge milestone for our lab. But I do think it's so important to tell you about a recent success. One of my students has been really struggling with trying to track a specific microbe in the fish pond. And his strategy was to develop really specific markers to track it. And he just wasn't having success. And it's taken him many months, maybe even a couple years to get it to work. he just didn't give up. And he finally was able, through just brute force, trial and error, got it to work. And a lot of times that's how science works. I'm just so proud of him that he was able to get it to work. And obviously that means he's going to get to graduate. So that's like excitement about a success in the future to be realized. And oftentimes I think our success just reaffirms not giving up. So I don't know if it's so much as like celebrating, yay, something amazing happened, versus celebrating not giving up. But my bottom line is I celebrate early and often in our lab because you can't take anything for granted.
Oh, definitely. I think it is so important to take a moment to appreciate and celebrate these successes of all forms and sizes, because they are relatively rare in science compared to the challenges, the failures, the struggles, and the slog that you sometimes have to go through to get to that point of turning in a paper or getting that grant submission. So I think that is wonderful to hear that you take a moment to celebrate these successes, because I know science can be all encompassing sometimes. We've touched on a couple of times throughout our conversation some of the ways that you are able to sort of take a step back, to disconnect a little bit. And you mentioned books a few times now. So I'd love to get some book recommendations for me and our listeners when we're ready to give our minds a break and think about something different. Do you have a favorite book that you can recommend?
I just finished reading Julian Agaran's book, The Properties of Perpetual Light. And Julian, if you're not familiar with his work, is an activist writer. He's an attorney. He comes from Guam. And it's a short book. You can sit with it and get through it. It has both prose as well as poetry. It has short essays as well as poetry. And it's all about stories of survivance, being a native person from Guam, just like living through a lot of militarism, frightened about the future and as far as climate change. And so it sounds, from what I'm telling you, it's dark, but it's actually very uplifting. And I think that a lot of times when we talk about climate change, our society is utilizing fear to stimulate action. And this book is very hopeful. So I really needed that in these times where a lot of things seems very stressed out and heavy and intense. His book is really uplifting. So I really love that. I also, if I'm allowed to have a second book, I really love Miranda Montgomery's Lessons from Plants. Miranda Montgomery is a plant scientist, and at the same time, she is someone who really reveals the idea of how individuals perceive and respond to their environment. And for her, her environment is approaching academia as a Black woman. And so I really have relied on a lot of Miranda's writings to help center myself a lot of times in academia. So I want to encourage everybody to read Lessons from Plants and Properties of Perpetual Light. They're both really inspirational.
Well, Rosie, these both sound like wonderful books. I look forward to picking them up myself. And we've touched on a lot of different aspects of your life and your career. One of the things I'd love to talk about a little bit more, if we can, are some of the opportunities that you've had to travel as a scientist. I know we mentioned in our introduction, you've done your training at a variety of different places. And I think this is often the case for scientists. You go different places for training, you travel for conferences. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
Yeah, and actually, I want to say that this place that I have the privilege of going to was a place I went to as a scientist in high school.
Oh, wow.
You can get the feeling that I started doing science at a young age. I've considered myself a scientific thinker for a really long time. And when I was in high school, as I mentioned, I was part of this high school hiking club, environmental science club called Huilama o Kamehameha, that was advised by Dr. Charles Burrows, who has passed recently. And he was a big thinker, and he felt like it was very important for us to not only do science in Hawaii, but to connect with other indigenous peoples of the Pacific. And so I actually want to share that Doc Burrows is what we called him affectionately. He was a huge thinker, and he saw that those of us at Kamehameha were doing research looking at migration patterns with kolea, which is a bird that migrates between Hawaii and Alaska. That I was doing work, for example, looking at ancient bird fossils and their evolutionary ancestry. And he connected that with a lot of the evolutionary work that was going on in Aotearoa or New Zealand, looking at the flightless moa. So we planned trips to go to Alaska and help to track the migration of the kolea that was here in Hawaii. And we also went to New Zealand and connected with avian biologists and other paleontologists, and went and looked at Moanala bones. All of these were meant to inspire our own work and connected us with scientists in those areas. And then, of course, Hawaiian oceanographers historically were great seafarers and sailed all over the Pacific. And he also planned a trip for us to go to Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, in the pathway of our ancestors. And so just being able to travel across the Pacific to connect the science of us as Indigenous peoples in Hawaii to that of other Indigenous peoples elsewhere, that is just so utterly memorable. So yeah, just being able to go to those places, especially as a young person. I think what's important too is to my doc had that expectation of us. He wasn't like, oh yeah, you guys are high school students. He was like, you are young scientists. And my goal is to connect you with other scientists who are working in these spaces and places. And how does that inspire you to do science here in Hawaii? So I think that's what made those trips so very memorable, is that there was this expectation put on us to come up to that level.
Absolutely. And it sounds like making those connections, both to the people and to the places, maybe had a really big impact on you and probably many of the others in that program. And I think that is an absolutely phenomenal way to approach it and to sort of introduce people. You're almost kind of getting thrown in on the deep end a little bit in terms of diving into science.
Totally thrown in on the deep end. Yes.
But that is amazing. And I think it maybe goes against the experience that a lot of people envision that scientists have, where everyone sort of starts with that little chemistry set and just sort of works their way step by step through the career pathway. And I think there are just, in general, a lot of stereotypes about scientists, about science careers. And we try to break those on our show by sharing some of the funny moments, the memories, the experiences of the scientists that we interview. So do you have a story of your own, Rosie, that maybe shows this human side of science, whether it was quirky traditions or just something that maybe goes against what people think of as life as a scientist?
I think the lab that to me had some of the funnest traditions was during my postdoc with Nicole King. And I think that it was always rooted in really good food. I wouldn't call it quirky, but Nicole always had this environment that was very much like, we do science hard, we have fun too, and we eat well. So some of my fond memories of working in Nicole's lab were always like lab dinners at her house in the backyard. Nicole really started the field of utilizing choanoflagellates as not only an evolutionary model, but a cell biological model. And in order for her to do that, she had to bring people together. So we hosted a number of times a choanoflagellate meeting where we invited everyone in the world to come. And then inevitably we would end up at Nicole's backyard. And I just remember just feeling like I was in this group with people who are all over the world, but united in thinking about this really, really interesting organism. And so I just think of that as a really caring community. I think some fields maybe are a little bit more competitive than others. And I think Nicole's personality, as well as many other major players in the field, such as Barry Leadbeater, really set down this strong ethic of care for other people in our community and just being helpful. The funny memories I have are just me and the grad students or me and other postdocs running around and being like, we have to go shopping at Costco because we're going to have this big party. And what do you think so-and-so is going to like to eat? And just being very concerned and maybe even a little bit fussy because we were at Berkeley. So food, we have that luxury of having really good food and fruit of oh no, we want to have this. This is really good food. So that's what I would say are some of the best funny science memories that I had with Nicole's lab. I mean, I guess as far as other things, as a scientist in high school, you are limited a lot by all the things you can do. You can't use radiation. You really can't use that much of dangerous chemicals. So I remember in high school having to be very, very creative about looking up and really understanding the methods about different things we have to do so that I could come up with alternative options to maybe using the easiest, fastest thing and maybe using the safest thing. So that was also a very funny science memory. I guess I'll leave you with one other science memory, which is that in the process of recreating these ancient bones, I convinced my now husband, he was my boyfriend back in high school, to save all of the chicken bones. I was on this weird kick where I wanted everybody to save the chicken bones from everything that they had. And he convinced his mother, who's very fastidious, it was okay to save chicken bones for me. And they got really gross. So I have this picture of him helping me isolate DNA from the bone marrow of a chicken. And I keep that right by my desk every day. That's the sacrifice of love. And that's how I knew he was a keeper, is because he helped me isolate DNA from really gross things when we were in high school. So when I think back, maybe that's the funniest science memory I have. And convincing people oh, you should have duck for Thanksgiving so I can have your duck. And you should have turkey and I need your turkey. And you should have goose so that I could get more weird avian bones for my science project.
Oh, that is phenomenal, Rosie. I love how these stories really highlight the sense of community, the creativity, and the humor. Everything sort of boiled together in science. And I think that is so true. And a lot of people have these sort of stories and experiences where you sort of had to do some out of the box thinking or unconventional methods to get the project to work. And I think in science, you just do what's got to get done. And oftentimes you're, of course, limited, as you alluded to, with funding, staff, technology, feasibility, methods, safety, whatever the case may be. If we took the barriers out of the way for you, Rosie, what is the one research question that you would want to answer most?
Wow, that is such a reality question that I think about all the time. I do want to say that the most unfun part of being a principal investigator, leading a lab, is constantly wanting to make sure that we are well-resourced. This is actually one of the things I didn't think about when I was wanting to be a scientist. Because, you're like, oh, I'm going to be a scientist. I'm going to do the science. But the only thing that has ever kept me up at night isn't like, oh my God, is this going to work? Although that has, but it doesn't keep me up the whole night. The only thing that's really ever made me the most stressed is really thinking through and making sure that I have enough funding to support everyone in my lab and make sure that everybody is taken care of and make sure that everybody has a living wage. But if that weren't an issue, I really want to scale up everything that for the work that we're doing in the fish pond. There are these tools now, these omics tools, where you can look at all the metabolites that an organism produces, all the lipids, which are the fats that an organism produces, sequencing the genomes. And if money were absolutely no object, I would do that for like the entire fish pond if I could. So to the question that would help me answer is like, who is there? Exactly who is there? Not only what could they be doing, because your genome kind of tells you the potential capacity, but what actually are they doing and how are they communicating with each other? And not only like, are they communicating, but how? What are the molecules? What's the chemical ecology of those interactions with one another? So if money, technology, and feasibility were not an issue, I would just totally nerd out on how this community of microorganisms is functioning together.
Oh, that's so cool. I love this proposed expansion of your current project. And I know we've talked about a lot of different aspects of your work in your career. I'd love to end with a piece of advice. So, Rosie, is there a piece of advice that you can share with our listeners, maybe one that really helped you?
I actually really did struggle in graduate school just with how long everything was taking. I was impatient. I had technical difficulties. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got, and there have been so many, so I don't know if this is the best piece of advice, but one of the best pieces of advice with regards to graduate school that I got was that no one can care more about your project, about you finishing than you. And that reminder about ultimate accountability was really nice. I was in a low point where I was blaming a lot of people and blaming a lot of technology for my woes and for my lack of progress. And somebody really lovingly sat me down and was like, nobody can care more than you. You have to care the most. And your advisor and your committee members and your lab mates, everybody's here to help you, but you ultimately have to drive the bus. You got to drive the bus. And that was a really great reset. And so whenever I get down, I reapply that. So giving me accountability in grad school was really important. I think also because I extend that now to like broader accountability too, is we as scientists, we have to care a lot about this stuff that we're working on. And more than just like picking yourself up off the ground, I think it also raises the question of ethics. Are we doing the best that we can do for the environments that we're working in, for the people who live in those environments as well? So yeah, I put it back on me.
Phenomenal. I think you brought up so many important points here with this advice. So thank you for sharing that. Is there any other last note of inspiration you'd like to end on today?
I guess one thing that I would say is that for those of us who are doing work outside is to remember that many of those places, we call them field sites, it really strips them and erases them of the context in which we're doing those studies. Probably no place on earth had no people or wasn't managed by people. Places become places because of the people that have lived in them. And it's so important for us as scientists to not strip everything away. Objectivity is just one framework that is an approach to maybe get a little bit better at designing our questions to do experiments. it's an attempt to remove bias. And I think bias is really what we should be striving to eliminate, not necessarily objectivity. So I think it's really important for us to remember the people who have made those places and spaces be the places that are really important for us to be studying.
Definitely. Such an important message, Rosie. Thank you. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to do so?
I can think of two ways. One is you can kind of see what we're up to on my lab's website, which is just alegadolab.org. The other is if you do want to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is actually the name of my favorite bacteria, which is called Algoraphagus. I do tend to talk a lot about social equity in science. So fair warning, it's not going to just be about like my love for microbes. I try to very much interrogate and make us all feel uncomfortable about the way that we're doing science. But yeah, I'd love to hear more from people.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely get connected. Rosie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Well, Rosie, it's been such a pleasure to have you here with us today. We appreciate you sharing part of your story. Listeners, great to have you here as well. And we hope you'll join us for our next episode of People Behind the Science.